It's the final days of July 2026, and while the world keeps its eyes locked on nightly strike counts and troop movements, the number that actually tells you how close this regime is to collapsing has nothing to do with bombers or bunker busters at all. It's zero. 0 barrels of crude oil. That's what Iran exported in May of this year, down from just over 2.1 million barrels a day back in February, the last full month before this war even started. A country that has spent nearly half a century building its entire political survival on oil revenue just went from more than 2 million barrels flowing out every single day to nothing at all. Not reduced, not squeezed, 0 completely and totally. That single number, more than any airstrike footage, more than any bunker buster dropped on a mountain in Fordo, is the real story of how the United States military brought Iran to its knees this year, because this war was never actually going to be won purely from the air. It was always going to be won by strangling the regime's ability to fund itself, and right now, that strangulation is working exactly as designed. Everyone watching this war has been trained by months of nightly headlines to measure progress in strike counts, 13 nights, then 14, target lists read out by CENTCOM, footage of missile bunkers erupting into fireballs. All of that is real, and all of it matters, and it has understandably dominated the coverage because it's visible, dramatic, and updates almost every single evening like clockwork. But airstrikes, however dramatic, are ultimately a story about infrastructure, buildings, launchers, radar arrays, things that can eventually, however painfully, be rebuilt, given enough time and money. What actually determines whether a government survives a war like this isn't how much of its infrastructure gets destroyed, it's whether it still has the money to rebuild any of it, to pay its soldiers, to keep its currency from becoming worthless overnight, and to keep enough of its own population fed that they don't turn against the regime itself before any foreign adversary even has to finish the job. That's the lens this entire story needs to be viewed through. And once you look at it that way, the picture of exactly how close Iran actually is to buckling looks very different from what the nightly strike footage alone would suggest. Because the real damage isn't measured in craters, it's measured in an empty treasury that no amount of rebuilding can refill overnight. Let's start with the scale of the economic devastation, because the numbers here are almost hard to process. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies estimates the total economic damage inflicted on Iran since this war began at approximately $144 billion, with a plausible range running as high as $300 billion, depending on how you account for cascading effects across the broader economy. That's roughly 40% of Iran's entire pre-war gross domestic product gone in the span of a few months. Oxford Economics separately estimated that the American naval blockade alone could cut off 70% of Iran's export income if sustained, and it has been sustained on and off since April. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies calculated the combined daily economic damage from the blockade at roughly $435 million a day. Every single day this thing continues. Multiply that out across the months this war has now run, and you start to understand why senior Iranian officials have privately warned it could take more than a decade just to rebuild what's already been lost, assuming rebuilding is even possible under the current political system, which, and we'll get into this, is very much an open question. Now let's talk about what a blockade like this actually does to a country's economy in practice, because it's not abstract. It shows up in every single corner of daily life for ordinary Iranians. Inflation in May alone came in at 8.8% for the month, which pushed the annual average up to 57.7%. Food inflation, specifically, hit even more brutal territory, soaring past 100% year over year by February, with bread and cereal prices up 140% and cooking oils and fats up more than 200%. Think about what that actually means for a family trying to put dinner on the table. Not a slight increase in the grocery bill, a complete reordering of what's affordable at all. Iran's currency has collapsed to roughly 1.32 million rial to the US dollar, a number so absurd that Iranian banks had to start distributing a 10 million rial banknote last month, the largest denomination note in the country's entire history, just so people could carry enough physical cash to make basic purchases without needing a duffel bag full of smaller bills. When your central bank has to invent a new, larger banknote just to keep pace with how worthless your currency has become, that's not a struggling economy anymore, that's a currency in genuine freefall. Picture what daily life actually looks like under numbers like that. A trip to the market that used to require a handful of bills now requires a stack thick enough to need its own bag. Families that used to budget monthly now have to think in terms of days, because prices that were accurate on Monday can be meaningfully out of date by Thursday. Savings accounts that took years to build get wiped out in value within weeks, not because anyone withdrew the money, but because the currency itself simply stopped meaning what it used to mean. This is the kind of economic environment that doesn't just strain a population, it fundamentally reshapes how people relate to their own government, Because a state that can no longer guarantee the basic stability of its own currency is a state that has lost one of the most fundamental promises any government makes to the people living under it. And it's not just prices and currency. Iran's actual industrial base has been gutted in ways that go far beyond anything the airstrikes alone could have caused. Automobile manufacturing collapsed by 47%. Washing machine production fell by 42%. Television manufacturing dropped 36%. Even the petrochemical sector, historically one of the more resilient parts of Iran's industrial economy because of the country's massive natural gas reserves, shrank by 17%. These aren't numbers pulled from foreign intelligence estimates either. These are figures reported by Iran's own statistical center, meaning even the regime's own internal data confirms the scale of the collapse. On top of the industrial contraction, capital flight has been staggering, with Iran's central bank data showing roughly $27 billion leaving the country in a single year. More than 7% of the entire economy walking out the door as anyone with money and means looks for a way to get it somewhere safer. Meanwhile, foreign direct investment, the kind of outside capital that would normally help a struggling economy rebuild, totaled a meager $1.6 billion for the entire previous year, according to United Nations figures, a number so small it barely registers as a rounding error against the scale of the damage already inflicted. Think about what a 47% collapse in automobile manufacturing actually means for the people employed in that industry. Not as an abstract statistic, but as a lived reality. Assembly lines running at half capacity or less mean layoffs, reduced hours, and entire supply chains of smaller parts suppliers and mechanics losing business simultaneously. The same story repeats across washing machine and television manufacturing, industries that don't sound strategically significant on their own, but collectively represent hundreds of thousands of jobs and an entire tier of Iran's urban middle class whose economic stability depended on factories that are now running well below the level needed to sustain full employment. When capital flight reaches $27 billion in a single year, that's not just wealthy elites moving money abroad for safekeeping. It's a signal read clearly by anyone still deciding whether to invest inside the country that the people with the most information about Iran's actual economic trajectory are the ones voting with their money to get it out as fast as possible. The International Monetary Fund's own projections paint just as bleak a picture from a different angle entirely. Iran's economy is expected to contract somewhere between 5 and 6% for the full year, depending on which specific report you're looking at, a genuinely severe recession by any global standard, layered directly on top of an economy that was already unraveling well before the first bomb of this war ever fell. It's worth remembering just how unusual it is for a modern government to be facing this specific combination of pressures all at once. Plenty of countries have weathered severe sanctions. Plenty of countries have weathered currency crises. Plenty of countries have fought and lost wars while still holding on to political power afterward. What's far rarer is a government trying to manage all three simultaneously, a currency in freefall, an active shooting war with the world's most powerful military, and a genuine leadership vacuum at the top, all while its most important source of national income has been reduced to functionally nothing. That combination is exactly why so many economists and regional analysts studying this conflict keep returning to the same conclusion, that whatever happens next on the battlefield may end up mattering less to Iran's ultimate fate than what continues happening, quietly and without dramatic footage, inside its own treasury. And that's actually the detail that gets lost in a lot of the coverage of this conflict. Iran wasn't a healthy, functioning economy that got broken by American and Israeli airstrikes back in late February. By the time Operation Epic Fury began, inflation had already topped 50%, the currency was already in free fall, merchants across the country had already shuttered their shops in protest over economic conditions, and at least one major private bank had already collapsed entirely. When American bombs started falling on Iran's petrochemical plants and military installations, they weren't breaking a functioning economy. They were shattering one that was already in advanced visible decline. That context matters enormously, because it means this war didn't create Iran's economic catastrophe from scratch. It accelerated and then locked in a collapse. The regime's own decades of mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions exposure had already set into motion. Here's what makes the blockade specifically so devastating compared to airstrikes alone. You can rebuild a bombed building. You can dig excavators into a collapsed missile bunker and eventually clear the rubble, which Iran has done repeatedly throughout this war. But you cannot rebuild oil revenue that simply never arrives in the first place. Every single day, the Strait of Hormuz stays constrained. Every day, American naval assets keep redirecting or disabling vessels, attempting to move Iranian crude. That's another day of lost revenue that can never actually be recovered later, because oil that doesn't get sold today doesn't get banked for tomorrow. It's just gone. A permanent hole in a national budget that was already stretched to its absolute limit before this war even began. That's why the naval blockade has proven, according to multiple independent economic analyses, to be the single most economically precise instrument in this entire campaign. more damaging in cumulative terms than any single strike package, because air power destroys infrastructure that can eventually, painfully, be rebuilt, while the blockade destroys revenue streams that vanish permanently the moment they're interrupted. There's a military logic underneath this economic strategy that's worth spelling out clearly, because it explains why American planners have leaned so heavily on the blockade rather than relying purely on strike packages to force Iran toward the negotiating table. A regime can absorb a remarkable amount of physical destruction and still project an image of defiance to its own population, pointing to rebuilt bunkers and repaired radar sites as evidence that resistance is working. It is far harder to spin an empty national treasury the same way. You cannot point a state television camera at a currency reserve that no longer has enough foreign exchange to import basic goods and frame that as a victory. Economic collapse doesn't offer the same propaganda opportunities that a smoking crater does, which is exactly why a sustained blockade, quiet, unglamorous, and rarely making for dramatic footage, has turned out to be such an effective complement to the louder, more visible airstrike campaign running in parallel. Now let's talk about how we actually got to this exact moment, because the path here matters for understanding why Iran's economic position is even worse right now than it was just a few weeks ago. Back in early April, the two sides reached a ceasefire, and for a brief moment, the entire world exhaled. Markets ripped higher. Oil prices plunged below $100 a barrel as traders priced in the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran agreed to reopen that critical waterway. Tankers that had been stalled for weeks started moving again, and there was genuine cautious optimism that this war might actually be winding down towards some kind of negotiated resolution. But the underlying tension never actually resolved. It just went quiet for a while. On July 8th, that ceasefire, the one negotiated at Versailles, collapsed entirely after Iran attacked 3 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration responded with a second major strike wave, hitting more than 80 separate targets in a single operation. And President Trump, speaking at the NATO summit, declared the ceasefire simply, flatly over. Brent crude immediately surged more than 5% to $78 a barrel, reversing 6 full weeks of the post-ceasefire relief that global markets had only just started to price in. War risk insurance for vessels transiting Hormuz got suspended almost overnight, and tanker rates spiked by 40% in the span of days, as shipping companies scrambled to reassess whether moving anything through that corridor was still worth the risk at all. That collapse mattered enormously, because for those brief weeks in between, roughly mid-June to mid-July, crude was actually flowing out of the Middle East Gulf at a real clip, close to 5.8 million barrels a day on average, compared to just 2.7 million barrels a day in the equivalent period before the ceasefire. That temporary surge in exports built up a genuine buffer, something close to 40 days' worth of extra crude inventory sitting in the global system, cushioning the blow that everyone knew would come if things fell apart again. And things did fall apart again. Since the ceasefire's collapse, average exports have dropped back down to somewhere between 3 and 4 million barrels a day, a dramatic reduction that threatens to burn through that entire buffer if the strait stays constrained much longer. And the timing here could hardly be worse for the global economy at large, because inventory floors are already sitting at genuinely critical levels. The storage hub at Cushing, Oklahoma, one of the most closely watched crude inventory benchmarks in the world, is hovering near operational minimums, and the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve itself is sitting at its lowest level in 43 years. There is very little cushion left anywhere in the system to absorb another prolonged disruption, which is exactly why every additional night this blockade continues carries outsized weight for markets far beyond the Persian Gulf itself. That fragility cuts in an interesting direction strategically, because it means the pressure isn't purely one-sided anymore. Every week, the strait stays constrained, tightens the noose further on Iran's own government finances, but it also raises the political and economic cost inside the United States and among its allies of sustaining that same pressure indefinitely, since a genuinely tight global oil market eventually shows up at the pump for ordinary American consumers too, exactly the kind of politically sensitive outcome that tends to shorten the runway any administration has for maintaining an aggressive posture. That's part of why this economic siege, however devastating for Iran, isn't necessarily something Washington can sustain forever without its own domestic costs. And it's part of why the diplomatic track, however frozen it looks right now, still matters as much as the military and economic pressure campaigns running alongside it. Let's zoom out and connect this economic strangulation to what's actually happening on the military side of this war right now, because the two campaigns are working together, not separately. Right now, U.S. Central Command is deep into its second wave of consecutive nightly strikes since that ceasefire collapsed, hitting Iranian military command centers, drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance networks, and maritime capability night after night, all specifically designed to degrade Iran's ability to keep threatening shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Every single one of those strikes reinforces the economic blockade running in parallel, because a missile battery or a fast attack boat that gets destroyed on a Tuesday night can't threaten a tanker on Wednesday morning. And every tanker that moves safely through the strait because of that suppression is more revenue flowing to the global economy, and just as importantly, more pressure staying locked onto Iran's own collapsing export numbers. This is why describing this as purely a military campaign, or purely an economic one, actually understates what's happening. It's a single coordinated strategy where air power creates the physical conditions that make the economic blockade sustainable, while the economic blockade creates the financial conditions that make Iran's military increasingly unable to replace what keeps getting destroyed. And that combination is exactly why Iran's own regime faces what analysts are increasingly describing it as a structural, not just cyclical, survival threat. This isn't a normal recession that a country waits out and eventually recovers from through the usual mechanisms of trade and investment. Iran is simultaneously dealing with a leadership vacuum after the death of Ali Khamenei at the very start of this war, a successor in his son Mojtaba, who has barely appeared in public since, a currency that requires an entirely new denomination of banknote just to function day to day, an industrial base that's lost nearly half its automobile output and more than a third of its television manufacturing, and an export economy that briefly recovered during the ceasefire, only to collapse right back down to near zero the moment the fighting resumed. Layer on top of that the ongoing unrest inside the country, protests that trace back to economic grievances stretching well before this war even began, and you have a regime trying to fight a war on its borders while simultaneously trying to keep its own population fed, employed, and quiet, with steadily shrinking resources to do either. Let's give this the honesty check it deserves, though, because a collapsing economy alone doesn't automatically topple a government. And history has shown repeatedly that authoritarian regimes can survive remarkably severe economic pain for a long time, particularly when the alternative to survival looks like total loss of power for the people currently running the country. Iran's leadership has weathered sanctions, currency collapses, and popular unrest before, and the Islamic Republic has spent 47 years demonstrating a willingness to prioritize its own political survival over the material well-being of its population, using repression, executions, and internet blackouts to manage unrest rather than genuine economic reform. There's also a real question of whether the regime's internal factions are even capable of agreeing on how to respond to this crisis. Reports out of Iran describe intense political infighting over tactical concessions related to any future ceasefire negotiations, layered on top of unresolved questions about succession and who actually holds real authority now that Khamenei is gone. A government that divided against itself, arguing over how much ground to concede while its economy burns, isn't necessarily a government on the verge of collapse. Sometimes it's simply a government too paralyzed to make any decision at all, which can drag this kind of economic siege out for far longer than the raw numbers alone would suggest. It's also worth acknowledging the limits of comparing this moment to previous economic crises Iran has weathered, because the scale here is genuinely different in kind, not just degree. Iran survived the sanctions regimes of the 2010s, survived currency crises earlier in the past decade, survived years of isolation following the collapse of the original nuclear deal. But each of those previous episodes happened while Iran's core military and industrial infrastructure remained largely intact, giving the regime a foundation to eventually stabilize around once sanctions pressure eased or new trading partners emerged. This time, the economic collapse is happening simultaneously with the physical destruction of much of that same infrastructure. Missile production facilities, drone manufacturing sites, and command and control networks, all being degraded at the same time. The money needed to rebuild any of it has effectively evaporated. Surviving economic pressure alone is one challenge. Surviving economic collapse and infrastructure destruction at the same time, with a leadership vacuum at the very top of the government, is a fundamentally harder problem, and it's genuinely unclear whether the regime's historical playbook for weathering sanctions still applies when so many of the underlying conditions have changed this dramatically all at once. There's also the question of who actually benefits from an Iranian collapse and who doesn't, because the regional picture here isn't as simple as the United States steadily winning, while Iran steadily loses with nothing else happening around it. China remains a crucial variable in this equation, because Chinese demand for whatever crude Iran can still move under the table, through sanctions evading routes and discounted pricing, has historically been one of the few remaining lifelines keeping Tehran's government solvent even during the worst stretches of American sanctions pressure. The IMF projects global oil prices averaging around $89 a barrel this year, and in theory, rising global prices should help any oil producer's bottom line. But Iran, according to its own state media reporting, is structurally blocked from capitalizing on that trend at all, because Sanctions, insurance restrictions, transport limitations, and mandatory discounts baked into whatever gray market sales it can still manage mean that even when global oil prices rise, Iran doesn't actually see much of that upside flow into its own foreign currency reserves. Instead, the regime gets hit with the worst of both worlds, rising global costs for food and imported goods without the offsetting benefit of rising oil revenue to pay for them, a genuinely brutal economic trap with no easy way out under current conditions. China's own calculus in all of this deserves closer attention too, because Beijing has historically had every incentive to keep just enough Iranian crude flowing at steep discounts to prevent the kind of total regime collapse that could destabilize a region China depends on for a meaningful share of its own energy imports. But that calculus shifts the more precarious Iran's position becomes. A regime this weakened, this economically desperate, becomes a less reliable long-term trading partner, regardless of how steep a discount it offers. And Chinese state buyers have shown in the past that they're perfectly willing to walk away from Iranian crude entirely when the compliance risks and insurance complications outweigh the savings on price. If China's appetite for discounted Iranian oil starts shrinking at the exact moment the American blockade is already squeezing legitimate exports down to zero, Iran loses what has functionally been its last remaining major customer of any real significance, and there simply isn't another buyer of comparable scale waiting in the wings to replace that relationship. Let's talk about the broader regional ripple effects too, because Iran's economic collapse doesn't stay neatly contained inside its own borders. Renewed clashes between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia threaten Saudi Arabia's own Red Sea export capacity, a corridor that would normally serve as a critical alternative route if Strait of Hormuz flows stay disrupted, meaning the one obvious pressure release valve for global oil markets is itself under threat from Iran's own regional proxy network. China's own demand outlook remains uncertain, adding another layer of unpredictability to how global markets absorb whatever happens next in the Gulf. And even Ukraine's ongoing war has become tangled into this same global energy picture, with intensified Ukrainian strikes on Russian refinery assets compressing global diesel supplies at the exact moment Middle Eastern crude flows are also under pressure. A genuinely unusual convergence of two separate wars simultaneously squeezing global energy markets from different directions at the same time. So what does bringing Iran to its knees actually look like in practice if it's not a dramatic surrender ceremony or a regime collapsing overnight in some cinematic finale? It looks exactly like what's happening right now. It looks like a currency requiring a brand new denomination just to function. It looks like automobile factories running at barely half capacity. It looks like oil tankers that either don't move at all or move only under the protection of American naval escorts, generating a fraction of the revenue the regime desperately needs just to keep its own military and internal security apparatus funded. It looks like a government whose own economists privately admit it could take more than a decade to rebuild what's already been lost, assuming political conditions ever stabilize enough to attract the kind of foreign investment that recovery would actually require, investment that isn't coming, and by every indication currently available, has no reason to start coming anytime soon under the Islamic Republic's current leadership. It also looks like a widening gap between what the regime tells its own people through state media and what everyone can see with their own eyes in daily life. State television can broadcast footage of rebuilt bunkers and defiant statements from military spokesmen, but it can't broadcast away the reality of a currency that requires a new banknote, or grocery prices that have more than doubled in a year, or factories running at half the workers they employed before this war began. That gap between official narrative and lived experience is exactly the kind of pressure that historically precedes major political shifts inside authoritarian systems, not because people suddenly develop new political convictions overnight, but because the daily cost of tolerating the status quo eventually exceeds whatever fear or apathy had been keeping them quiet beforehand. Iran has already seen waves of protest tied directly to economic grievances in recent years, and there is no reason to believe a population now living through hyperinflation, industrial collapse, and a currency in freefall simultaneously is going to be more patient than the population that took to the streets over comparatively milder economic conditions in years past. The honest strategic assessment here is that this war was never actually going to be decided purely by how many nights of airstrikes CENTCOM could sustain, or how many bunker busters got dropped on how many mountains. It was always going to be decided by whether Iran's regime could keep functioning, keep paying its own security forces, keep its own currency from becoming worthless, and keep enough of its population fed and quiet long enough to outlast American political will, the exact same bet Iran's leadership has been making since this war first began back in February. Right now, every single economic indicator available, from zero oil exports to double-digit monthly inflation, to an entirely new banknote denomination, to nearly half its industrial base in outright collapse, suggests that bet is failing badly, and failing in ways that air power alone could never have accomplished on its own. The bombs got the headlines, The blockade is what's actually bringing this regime to its knees, one lost barrel of oil revenue at a time, and unlike a bombed bunker, there's no excavator that can dig that revenue back out of the ground once it's gone. What do you think happens from here? Do you think Iran's regime finds some way to survive this economic siege, the way it survived previous rounds of sanctions and unrest? Or do you think this specific combination of military pressure and total export collapse finally becomes the thing that actually forces real political change inside the country? Let me know what you think in the comments, because the economic numbers coming out of this war tell a very different and arguably far more decisive story than the nightly strike counts everyone's been focused on. If this breakdown helped you understand the real pressure point in this entire conflict, go ahead and give it a like. Share it with anyone who's only been following the airstrike headlines and missing this side of the story. And subscribe so you don't miss the next update, because between the bombs falling above and the economy collapsing beneath it, this regime is being squeezed from every direction at once. And there's no clear sign of that pressure letting up anytime soon. Keep watching the numbers, not just the nightly strike counts, because they'll tell you far more about where this war is actually headed. Watch whether Iran's crude exports climb back toward that brief post-ceasefire peak or stay pinned near zero. Watch whether the currency stabilizes even slightly or keeps sliding toward whatever denomination comes after a 10 million rial note. And watch whether China's appetite for discounted Iranian oil holds steady or starts quietly shrinking as the regime's overall stability becomes harder to ignore. Those three indicators, far more than any single night of strikes, will tell you whether this economic siege ends in some kind of negotiated survival for the regime, or in the kind of structural collapse that no amount of rebuilt bunkers or defiant state television broadcasts can paper over.